Well, welcome back to the Forum podcast, our very first of 2024. I hope you enjoyed the holiday season wherever you are in the world, that you're well rested and you're set for a great year ahead. We're going to go ahead and kickstart this year's podcast series by looking at the American Cancer Society's work in patient support. And I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Arif Kamal, our Chief Patient Officer. Dr. Kamal, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So let's start off. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. Well, I appreciate being here. I am a medical oncologist, which means I treat cancer as a physician. I'm also a palliative care physician, which means I pay a lot of attention to quality of life issues that my patients go through. And as the inaugural Chief Patient Officer at ACS for the past 2 years, I have the privilege of leading a team of people who run our patient programming, anything that touches patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals across the US and across the world, we pay attention to. And our particular focus is all the areas of distress that happen across the cancer continuum, from cancer prevention through lifestyle change, through survivorship, end-of-life care, and bereavement as well, and everything in between. And what we know is that the challenges that are faced in one particular country are oftentimes shared in others. Sometimes there's a resource difference that needs to be accounted for, but fundamentally, every person who gets diagnosed with cancer wants an equal and just opportunity to reach a cure if possible, or live, their best quality of life. And that's what we do here at the American Cancer Society.
Awesome. I think patient support has always been one of the driving factors behind national cancer charities like ours and like our network of partners. American Cancer Society is big and it has a broad range of work. Some of our partners are much smaller, but this is always something that's super important because it touches directly to the lives of those affected. Can you tell us a little bit about the various programs that sit under your pillar and the impact that they have on those patients?
Our signature programs at the American Cancer Society involve addressing the major barriers people face in accessing timely cancer care. And, to start, that oftentimes begins with lodging and transportation. So we think a lot about programming that helps patients get to the care that they need. In my clinical experience, transportation is the most common barrier. And across the world, we find, very similar issues too. In fact, that where care may not be as democratized across a region, that people do have to travel for particularly innovative treatments or new treatments or treatments only found at universities or large medical centers. So that we know is an important challenge. I would say the other challenge too is really access to clinical trials. Globally, less than 3% of adults who are eligible for cancer clinical trials ever enter those clinical trials. And we know that in the last decade, clinical trials have really shifted from, experimentation or trying something brand new, unknown, to really being about access to innovation, that the newest, best things now in cancer are available in clinical trials. So we think about that. And lastly, we think a lot about investing in navigation. We have a large project called Beacon, which involves 17 or 20 different countries in increasing their navigation capacity. And navigation just means having a buddy, a Sherpa, a guide, a person whose role it is to wake up every morning and think about how to get patients to the right care and connected to the right resources. And I see those as very common threads, regardless of where someone lives in the world, that are solutions that have to be made to get timely access to care.
Right. I mean, such super important work. And that barrier of that orientation, I imagine, for someone who has to travel to a center in a big city that maybe they've never spent much time in that city or ever been there before. Sure. And then all of a sudden they have to orientate themselves and know where to go and know where to be. So that is hugely important. So what does that look like? Where do people find those kind of resources in the US? Like, where are those navigators based and how do they work?
Yeah, well, we put a lot of effort in ACS launching its first ever patient-facing app, and the app is not just to have an app; it's really to provide digital navigation to people newly diagnosed with cancer. As you can recognize increasingly, regardless where someone lives in the world, that the use of smartphones and access to internet is largely ubiquitous. And in fact, many interventions in cancer have involved, SMS-based, interventions. And so, playing on that, we've created ACS's first ever app. And the idea is to connect people to each other so that they can get that sort of tacit information, which you're talking about. So let's say someone lives in a small town, but they have to go to the large city. That's a challenge I face here in my own practice. I mean, I live in a city of about 500,000, but I take care of patients in a city of about 20,000. And for many of them, they're very nervous to travel to the big city. And so what we did is we created a peer-to-peer networking program where people can talk to each other via the app. They can chat and actually ask each other questions like, well, should I take a bus or a train, or should I drive? Where do I park? What does that look like? When is traffic really bad? So on and so forth. That information is super important, but oftentimes people only find it by accidentally running into each other. In the case of my clinic, they are in the waiting room talking to each other like, hey, how about this? How about that? How about this? And we're trying to create some deliberate structure so that people can have opportunities to talk to each other about that. And frankly, navigate each other in that way. And we think that peer-to-peer network is so scalable and so relatable. And what it leans upon is people's lived experiences. Because you might ask me a question about what's it like to travel into the big city, and I could tell you I'm very comfortable with it because that's what I do every day. But for finding a neighbor or a friend who says, oh yeah, I'm just as nervous as you are, but let me tell you what I did to make it work for me, actually ends up being a very powerful message.
Yeah, I can see that's an awesome tool and something to really connect a community who are going through the same challenges. So cool. My ears also pricked up. I found it interesting. You mentioned around clinical trials and the shift that kind of from the old days where it was, this is something new and innovative, but really we don't know about it, to something really cutting edge. Can you give us a little more context on that to understand why is that? What is the difference that you're referring to there?
Yeah, so it's important to recognize that oncology as a clinical practice is actually not that old. I mean, if you look at the history, it was in the 60s and 70s that we were giving people mustard gas and various chemical warfare agents that we knew killed cells, but they also importantly killed bodies, right? And we were walking this fine line between killing bad cells and not killing good cells. And I'm not sure we were all that great at it, but it's the best we could do. You fast forward to modern day, we now have specific targets. So we're not killing any cell, which is what we did in the 60s. We're not killing cells that just only rapidly divide, which is what we did in the 80s and 90s. And rapidly dividing cells are cancer cells, but they're also hair cells and GI cells, that's why your hair falls out when you get standard chemotherapy. That's why you get nauseated, because those cells are also fast dividing and they get affected. Fast forward to today, now we're looking for specific targets or markers that are only found on tumor cells, or we are uncovering the camouflage that cancer cells use to hide themselves from the immune system. Imagine that they are wearing camouflage, that we give medicines to pull that camouflage off, and then someone's own inherent immune system can go fight their cancer. That's just a more intelligent way to do that. And that means that we generally have less side effects, generally have less mortality from our treatments. And that means that when we do clinical trials, we can look for patients with a particular marker on their cell and then give them the particular medicine that goes after that marker. That means there's less experimentation, because you're not like, well, let's give it and see what happens. What you're really asking the question is not does it work, but what's the right dose? How often do we give it? What's the effect that it's going to have? Not whether it's going to work. And that change is fundamentally why clinical trials are so different now than they were before. But the challenges remain. Today versus 1980, there's no more people participating in clinical trials than 3 decades ago. And we're not going to reach cancer cure unless more people are getting those innovative things earlier in their journey through clinical trials.
Really interesting. Such a positive, hopeful message, actually, of greater survivorship, which is the trend we've been seeing year over year, especially within the States. And that kind of gives me a good segue to my next topic. 33 of our partners who receive this podcast are partners through our Relay for Life program. And so their fees contribute to the work that we do outside of US borders, where there's probably greater disparities. The US probably has a great degree of the cutting edge support and treatments. And the reason we do our program, I'd love you to talk about it because I know the patient support side of that sits under you. Can you share with us a little bit more specifically about the work that we do outside of US borders in this area?
Yeah, well, it's across the cancer continuum. We've got everything from looking at cervical cancer elimination through HPV vaccination in countries where there's a combination of either lack of access to the HPV vaccine or misinformation or disinformation related to it. We all know in the past couple of years, because of COVID, there's been a questioning of medical science and what to do. And you have to message that in a culturally appropriate way, because there may be alternative ways that people are used to managing or treating particular diseases. It's very clear, though, that HPV based cervical cancer, which is 98% of all cervical cancer, is by this virus. This virus is preventable through a vaccine. That we in our lifetime could eliminate, the same way we did polio, eliminate cervical cancer from the face of the earth within our lifetimes. But it takes that concerted effort. So we're doing that in several different countries. I mentioned our navigation work. We're also looking at access to care in particular. And I would say that is the unique defining piece between what we do in the States and what we do around the world, as we work with various different partners to find pricing discounts and access pieces. We work with local ministries and governments to think about access not only to cancer treatments, including radiation, but also to supportive care interventions like pain medicine. We recognize for many cancer patients, they have uncontrolled pain, but because of local laws or regulations or concerns about opioid addiction and abuse, which are real concerns, that people don't have access to things like opioids. So, we really run the gamut, but I'm excited that the American Cancer Society, we are looking at our total portfolio, looking at where else we could collaborate, because I see lots of opportunities to collaborate with existing organizations and with more and new organizations as well. And I think our real highest and best use is not necessarily to always lead or be the idea generator. We can be, if someone's got the rocket, we can be the fuel, right? And if someone, has the fuel, then we can put parts of the rocket together. But the point is, we want to work together with others, and we're looking to accelerate a lot of our global work as in 2024 and 2025, as we sort of relook our strategic plan and think about growth of the program.
That's awesome. That's so cool to hear. And I think also it connected in my brain, you were talking about the app and how technology makes all this so much more possible to create a global community of cancer charities who can share and to learn from each other and to present their best practices. It creates such a great opportunity. And well, not even just charities, but even, like you mentioned, ministries of health in different countries that we can collaborate with too. This is also super interesting. One last question then. Looking forward, what's the ambition? Is there any area that we would love to do more of, that we can get into, or that there's something new down the track coming in patient support?
Yeah, well, I appreciate being on your podcast. I think that there's a lot of, I think innovations that are happening across the world that are really important to pay attention to, particularly as it relates to access. And one of them is around early detection. We're seeing a lot of innovation in early detection methods that don't even start with a detectable cancer through a radiologic approach. So it's one thing if every country had an MRI or a PET scanner, you could just scan people up and down, but really blood-based ways to find early detection of cancer is really something that's going to change the world. But obviously the issues are around access. So it might change the states at first, but it's the type of technology that can really reduce the burden of cancer worldwide, because you can find it at a time when you can cut it out, irradiate it, and you don't have to give chemotherapy or something else. So I would say that's a big disruptor that's coming. There's already technology that exists, but I think the global issue is really around access to the tests, and then importantly, access to the follow-up around that, because the blood test might say you might have a pancreas cancer, but then at that point, the same issues that are barriers to care or barriers to follow-up come into place. And so all you've done is sort of accelerated the need for having these downstream pieces in place. I would say the second big thing that's happening across the globe is a movement towards more cancer care in the home or in community environments. And we're seeing that in the US, we're seeing it in Canada, and we're seeing some other sort of Western countries. This thought that if cancer care is becoming less toxic and maybe needs less hour-to-hour monitoring, that for some patients, just like they receive their diabetes care at home or their heart care at home, that they can actually receive their cancer care at home, not just from an early detection, but actually chemotherapy or targeted agents hanging in a bag dripping in their own home because it makes them more comfortable and they get to be around their pets and their family and so on. And I see that as a really big shift too. But obviously the issues here is for both of those innovations, what does that access look like? How does everyone, get a fair opportunity to access those innovations? And then importantly, what do we learn from that are downstream implications that people also need to have access to, and how do we solve those barriers?
That is awesome and so interesting. Dr. Kamal, thank you so much for your time today. I know that all of our watchers will enjoy listening to this and it'll spark their ideas and their thoughts and relating to the work that they do. So we really appreciate it. Thanks so much, and we look forward to connecting in the future.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.